Apologies if you're getting a bit sick of seeing me up here because I gave a talk already yesterday. Actually, that's not quite true because if there's one thing I enjoy more than hearing the sound of my own voice, it's having it amplified over a PA system to an audience. So, yeah. But very briefly, in case you heard this already, I work for Devio, a Swiss-based Django agency. We're here sponsoring as Django CMS, which is one of our open source products, so you've probably had some of our Welsh cakes. And I'm a Django developer and a member of the Django core team. So in the last days of January this year, I was completely unnerved and convinced that I had finally truly bitten off more than I was going to be able to chew. Because Python Namibia 2015 was going to be the first ever Python conference in the country. I was organizing it, and I really had no idea what was going to happen. It was going to be the biggest leap in the dark that I had ever taken. And I was lying in bed at night, unable to go to sleep, and wishing for an ash cloud or a global pilot strike or some kind of political crisis or almost anything that would save me from having to go through with this thing that I've been planning for years, that I'd committed myself and other people to, and that was now about to come to fruition. So in my worst dreams, I was going to be remembered as that idiot who tried to organize a conference and set back the cause of open source software in Africa for a generation. And I was terrified of ruining my reputation, if there was such a thing, whatever you think that might be worth, but certainly of wasting potentially a lot of other people's money and dragging 2 universities and several companies into some sort of hubristic debacle. Well, there was no ash cloud. And on the morning of the 31st of January this year, we set off, a dozen of us in a minibus, heading from Cardiff to London Heathrow Airport. And at Heathrow, we met Alan McNeil-Jackson from Aptivate, who's over there, and his colleague Tom, because Aptivate was sponsoring, one of the sponsors of the event. And then in Frankfurt, for our connection, we met Luc van Hempt from the Netherlands, because the Dutch Django Association was also supporting the event. And we left behind this foul, cold European winter, and we through the night, and we woke up over Africa. Well, I didn't wake up over Africa because I was awake anyway, because my job on an aeroplane is to sit next to a window and make sure the wings don't fall off. But the other people woke up over Africa. So if you're ever in an aeroplane with me, it's best not to sit between me and a window, because that's probably the most uncomfortable seat on the plane. It was summer in Namibia, and we arrived in Windhoek, this African capital that none of us knew or had ever been to. And that was our home for the next few days. The next morning, we met 2 more people, Jason Rudolph and Shay Frent from GitHub, because GitHub was also sponsoring the event. And we were picked up by a minibus and taken to the University of Namibia's campus. And we received the warmest welcome imaginable from them. They were ready for us. And here are some of the students who were the attendees. And we were greeted by people like the Vice Chancellor of the university and other high officials for the university. And I've never been, I don't think any of us had ever been anywhere to find so many people excited that we were there. It's not the normal kind of reception I get when I go places. So they were really thrilled that this event was coming there for them. So, and after that, we weren't nervous, or none of us were nervous anymore. All of us a little bit sort of keyed up with nervous excitement, but there just wasn't any time for that, because we were far too busy running this conference, which was 4 days of talks, workshops, and coding. Mostly the attendees were students from the University of Namibia, but there were also their teachers and some people from outside the university. Some people had traveled from outside Namibia to be there too. And we gave talks. There's Vincent Knight over there, a mathematician, and they gave talks. You can't see this clearly up there, but this student, he was one of the students, his project was to put sensors out in the desert to measure light, because he was recording light pollution. And this was in support of an international proposal for a telescope array that was going to be situated in the desert. Of course, for telescope arrays, you want very clear skies, which is what you get in the Namibian desert. And he was bringing back all this data from his little devices and processing them with Python. So we met another student, I think he was an undergraduate actually, who had built a kind of exchange site, a website for swapping things. And people could send in by text message details of the thing that they didn't want anymore. And then it was a kind of like free cycle, and he said that this became almost a full-time activity for him. He wasn't earning any money for it, but it was still a full-time activity for him, because until he automated more and more of it, so people were exchanging all these things that they had finished using. Of course, this being Africa, there's a lot less stuff wasted than we might be used to. So it was really exciting to hear about these things that people were doing. And of course, being a conference, we shared all our meals with them and had plenty of time to talk with them and find out about all the things that they were doing or trying to do or wanted to do. We had no idea what we were going to find there. In fact, for most of them, or nearly all of them, this was their first encounter with Python, even if they'd done some other programming before. Mostly it was either Java, which was part of their university course, or PHP if they'd learned some things on their own, or even some Microsoft Visual Basic or whatever it is that they do. But no, I don't know. I'm not laughing at it. I just don't know what they do. I only know Python and Django. So this was our office back at our hotel. I don't know if you said my blood type is coffee. And we sat there until late every night, after every day, just replanning what we were going to do the next day, because all of our plans had to be made up as we went along, sometimes right when we were doing them, because everything changed, some things didn't work, things had to be moved, and we were discovering things, all the things that we needed to know as we went along. But as soon as the event started, we realized that everything actually was going to be all right. But it was, when we were back at the hotel looking over the first day on that first night, we realized that it was going to be better than just successful. We were right in the middle of something really, really exciting. So that was us every night until late. You can't see any beer on that table, but I can tell you there were plenty of beers on the table. And in fact, the whole thing went brilliantly. I mean, there were technical hitches and network issues of all kinds. Some interesting ones, like, for example, trying to get a workshop full of people to pull things down or push things up to GitHub when the network is packing in every 2 minutes, or people passing around USB sticks full of software images and viruses for all these ancient, unprotected laptops. They were all, most of them were using very old Windows laptops. A couple of them had Linux, but mostly it was Microsoft Windows. So there were all kinds of technical hitches right the way through. But they weren't the important things, because what was really clear was that the networks that mattered for this were the ones of mutual understanding and trust that just developed over the 4 days. And by the end of the 4 days, we realized that we really had pulled it off. It really had worked. And this is a small number of the people who were there. There were about 80 people there. I think the official number was 84 people in total. Just very briefly, some of the things that really stick in my mind. One was a workshop I can't remember what it was on. It was on a Python messaging system given by one of the Namibians who signed up to give a workshop. And there were two people sitting in the front. One was a white Namibian, one was a black Namibian. And one of them was having some trouble with his computer. But they were sitting with a space in between them. And Namibia has had a different history from South Africa. So although it was ruled by South Africa and suffered some parts of the population suffered very badly under that, it's been independent for 20 years now, and it has taken quite a different path from South Africa. So there isn't the same racial tension that is part of South African life. But at the same time, there is a distance between the white people and the black people on the whole. And these two people were sitting next to each other with a clear gap between them. And Vincent said, just give it up with that, and why don't you pair program? And they went, vroom! And they looked at each other with a bit of surprise at being told to do this. And in fact, then one of them closed it up, gave up with his laptop and sat down next to the other. And then 5 minutes later, they were arguing with each other about how to solve the problem and so on. So, and that was a really interesting thing to see unfold in front of your eyes from this kind of, not mistrust, but diffidence and distance to being there, saying, no, absolutely. Yes. Another one was seeing one of the students, Jessica, who encountered Python on the first day, and on the fourth day, she gave a lightning talk with a live coding demonstration in front of the vice chancellor of her university. So that was really good too. She was one of 3 Namibians who came to DjangoCon Europe because the university helped bring them over. We had some funding for them, so that was really nice that they came to Cardiff to see another part of the community. And the third thing that I will remember very well is walking into into the main lecture hall that we were using on the last day. And Vincent said, look up there. He said, that's the Python Namibia Society forming itself. So for me, this experience, the whole thing was quite overwhelming. And it was the outcome of a huge amount of personal effort, and I should say effort on the part of numerous other people. It's probably the most valuable thing I feel that I've ever done in the world. What made it possible was the support that there was for this project. We had 2 main partners. One was the University of Namibia, which was our host, and they organized things there for us, and they said, what would you like us to do? And they tried to do it, whatever it was. And the other was the Phoenix Project, which is an engagement project from Cardiff University. So I was no longer working at Cardiff University at the time, but I'd already started the conversations with certain people at Cardiff University about this. And so I can tell you more about that later. But Cardiff University and the University of Namibia were absolutely key to this. Cardiff University, especially for the funding. Also, we had a lot of support from the open source software world, the Python Software Foundation, the Dutch Django Association, the Django France Association, Django Cardiff, as well as companies like Activate, Devio, GitHub, Vimeo, and so on. And what staggered me was that thinking about what was in it for some of these are commercial companies, what was in it for a supporter like Devio or GitHub? And I can think, nothing except the sheer thrill of being involved in something like that. So that's a really nice thing to realize about commercial organizations that are working in your community. It tells you something about the kind of community, the kind of world that we have. So we're extraordinarily grateful to all of them for their involvement, for actually coming there, in the case of Activate and GitHub, and the representative of the Dutch Django Association, Luke, because it really made it. It made it possible. Now, Python Namibia was just a first step, and though it was one of the most extraordinary things that many of us had been involved in, it wasn't the real point. The real point is this: what does free open source software mean for the developing world? Well, what does it mean for us? Okay? So start by thinking what it has meant for us here in the very developed world with our wealthy people, governments, companies, and institutions. And I mean, think how much money it has saved us that we have free software, and how much more it has allowed us to achieve. And think how much worse off we'd be if we'd had to pay for all of it, and how much further behind we'd be if we had not been allowed to take it and improve it and adapt it to our own purposes. Now, our wealthy people, governments, companies, and institutions, unlike the poorer ones in many parts of the developing world, can actually afford to pay for these things we need if we had to. So we'd be able to do it if we had to. It might be a pain, but we could afford it. And crucially, at least some of that money, if we had to pay for it, would be coming back into our own economies, because we're the economies that are producing this stuff. So we'd get by without it, and we'd be able to afford it if we had to pay for it. We'd be okay without open source software, even if we were a little bit worse off than we are now. We can afford to be users of systems whose development, maintenance, and improvement can only be achieved by the suppliers. We can afford to be locked in to the suppliers. And it wouldn't even be all bad news, because we're producers as well as consumers of that stuff. But the less you have to begin with, the less easily you can afford this. Now, all the world needs software, including the developing world. They need IT systems and infrastructure projects and personal computers just like everyone else. And of course, all the world needs to be able to invest in IT systems and, that are adaptable to future and changing needs, and able to keep pace with technological developments and standards that themselves evolve and develop. And the choices for the developing world are, on one hand, to buy essential technology that they need that's hard to afford, or to do without it, or to struggle wastefully with inefficient and outdated technology, or else have to pay for it all over again when it's time to buy it again. Even when this technology is given as a gift, as it sometimes is, that's still a burden, because there's still the burden of being beholden to the supplier, unless the recipients are expected to become somehow magically rich enough in a few years' time to pay for the necessary upgrades. So the world's least wealthy nations can least afford to invest in technology that locks them in. So these are some of the threats that software presents to the developing world. Our industry, what we do, our work could represent a further millstone around the neck of the parts of the world that could afford that least. So what's this question again? What does free software, open source software mean for the developing world? Well, I think it means a way to avoid these dilemmas. Okay. For developing nations, free open source software means a way for them to own and develop their own systems and projects, to take charge of the technology that they rely on, and to be participants in the communities and industries that produce it. In fact, the comparatively low cost of open source systems lowers the bar to acquisition and participation. So, for example, if a developing nation is to develop the skill set required to create and maintain software that meets its own needs, then it can educate and train its own software developers, equipping its schools and its universities appropriately, so that they are able to afford future maintenance of the systems that they rely on. So open source systems make it possible to create a virtuous circle of sustainable investment. You can invest in yourself and your own people instead of having to send money away where it will never come back. So I truly believe that free open source software is a key, one key, not the only one, but a key to the well-being and prosperity of developing nations and their people. It represents an opportunity for them to become producers and not just consumers of the software that increasingly defines our world, and to become authors and owners of the technology that they need. And this software depends on its communities, and of course the well-being of those communities are directly linked to the community's events, just like this PyCon here. So in fact, in my own case, my own career is something I owe to our community conferences. So events are one of those keys, or part of what's needed, and it's something that we can do. It's something that we know that we are good at. So this idea of a Python conference in an African country, in a developing nation, is not just an exciting, exotic adventure for us, but it's something much more meaningful and significant. It represents some opportunities for real, enduring global change, a redistribution of wealth and power and privilege. And we're used to hearing about the ways in which the software industry makes everything worse, consolidates power and wealth in the hands of those who already have it. But here's one anyway, where it could be working the other way. Here's another way to look at it. You've probably heard in the news recently that NHS managers are warning the government that tighter immigration controls could have a disastrous effect on healthcare services, because the NHS needs to bring in, it needs to import a lot of workers, healthcare workers, nurses, and so on. Well, that might be true, and it might be bad for the NHS and the people who need it if the NHS can't get its Ugandan or Tanzanian or Filipino nurses and healthcare workers. But that means these healthcare workers and nurses are coming from those places. If a nurse is working in Britain, it means they're not working in the usually poorer country where they were trained, the country that paid a lot of money to train them, that invested a lot in their training and skills. So importing labor from the developing world can be quite good for us, but it can be very damaging to those societies and economies. Even if the people working here send money back home, it's still destabilizing. You know, tax revenues disappear, continuity is lost, senior people with experience are no longer there. Now, nurses can't work remotely, but software developers can. So just, who's a remote working software developer here? Okay, it's a significant number of people. So we can do our job just as well from a different place. There are a lot of remote software developers working for Western European or American companies in the east of Europe. So they are earning money. They are not leaving their countries. They are earning money, paying taxes in their countries. They are there as, if they're senior people, mentors and guides for the next generations of people there. It's a way for wealth to be redistributed from the richer parts of the world to the less rich parts of the world. Software development could be a way for this to work in Africa. And I probably don't need you to remind you what people think of when they think of Africa. They think of, you know, war and hunger and basket case economies and kleptocratic governments and corruption, the things that are wrong. Or they think about the West's role in either trying to make this better or having made it worse. And when people talk positively about Africa, they'll talk about things like rich natural resources, and their eyes will light up, or they'll talk about how beautiful it is and an exotic, unspoiled tourist destination. So the relationships that the West has with Africa, certainly, range from the rapacious to the condescending. And there's much more to Africa than this. And those are not the only kind of relationships that we can have or should have with Africa. It's full of people with ideas and ambitions and plans of their own. And the Python community in Namibia, this small community, represents a chance to have a different kind of relationship as collaborators and members of the same global community. So Python Namibia was a success, but it wasn't what made us a success. Wasn't what happened there back in February. It wasn't that we had a good time and everybody got a lot out of it. It's this, that in February next year, there will be a PYCON in Namibia organized by the local Python community that emerged from the conference we held, by the people we met who were inspired to do it for themselves. It will have 180 attendees from all over the world, 5 days of talks, workshops, collaboration, social events. In other words, it's a PYCON. If you liked this one, you'll like that. If you're wondering about Namibia, it's a lovely country. Windhoek is a safe and relaxed city. If you like 19th century German provincial architecture and post-colonial statues, you'll enjoy it a lot. Okay? It's almost the same, but in interesting ways, reckon quite different. Yeah? These pictures were taken in early February, just in case you're thinking about what the winter's like here in February. This is what it will cost you to get there. We have money from the Django UK Society to help you get there if you want to come and want to be a part of it. So we want you to join us in February 2016 in Namibia. The winter here is atrocious. By February, you'll want that warmth. It will be midsummer in Namibia. You'll meet some wonderful people, students and others too. We want sponsors, but mostly we want people just to be there. And the future of software communities like the one in Namibia depends upon their relationships with us and our being able to be with them. We need to be with each other, and it's much easier for us to visit them than for them to visit us. So take a look at that, and maybe you'll be there in Namibia with us.